Professor Lawrence Lau, your book is important because it follows the timeline of the pandemic as it happened. Was it difficult, therefore, to keep up with the changes as the virus and its behavior also changed?
Well, I think you're right, but I think for China, it is fortunately is simple because, in February, I started looking at data. At the time, I actually predicted that it will end by the end of March. Actually ended at the end of March, right? But since then, China actually had managed extremely well. Right? There's no second wave, no third wave. So it's complete here. But if you look at the other countries and regions, that's not the case. See, in this book, I basically said Hong Kong is okay. But that's because I ended in June, early June, right? But there's this third wave that is just now, began in around middle of June, right? It's now just about coming to an end, right? So, I mean, a lot of it is actually cannot be kept up to date.
Let's take a look at some of the insights that you share with us in this book that you co-author with Xiong Yan. And you made this important point at the start of the book that you wrote this as economists, not as health economists, nor as healthcare professionals. So you bring something very different, a different dimension into this understanding.
Yes.
What different understanding do you think it brings?
I tell you that the most important thing is that it is evidence-based, right? I know nothing about medicine, right? But I had one experience, and that is back in 2003. I was still living in America, and then there was a SARS outbreak, right? And then I was trying to figure out when would it end, right? And around March at the time, I predicted it would end by June. Now, you may ask, how do you know that? It's actually a very simple idea. What I did was to trace the beginning of the first case. It was in Guangdong, right? And then I figured out, okay, if we were really infectious, by March, it should have been a few million people, right? But there weren't that many cases, right? So you could work out how infectious it was, right? And then with that data, you can then predict when it would all end. Because it's the same idea. If you have SARS, you will identify, you were isolated, then you wouldn't spread to anybody else, right? So that's the same idea. And that's really what got me interested this time. I said, okay, let's see if I could predict when it would end. And so I look at the data in February. The first case in Wuhan was probably in December, right? Then you can work out. And if actually COVID-19 actually is much more infectious than SARS, much more infectious than SARS, but not as fatal as SARS. If you have SARS, I mean, you're less likely to catch it, but if you catch it, you're less likely to survive, right? So I think make a prediction, and everybody thought I was being too optimistic. This is in the middle of February. I said it would probably come to an end in China by the end of March.
Well, I have to admit that I eat humble pie, because when I interviewed you very early on in what was now characterized as a pandemic, you put forward a number of ideas that I was concerned about, which was, for example, a digital health passport where we are tested and then we can show at borders whether we've been tested and so on and so forth. Also, you spoke about restricting movement of people. You talked even about mainland China opening up, say, for example, 5 airports versus potentially dozens. And at the time, I thought to myself that what Professor Lau is suggesting could stigmatize a people further. I was wrong on every count. And as global governments are now discovering for themselves, they're only just beginning to pick up on the ideas that you spoke about 6 months ago.
Right.
What do you think is important now if you could go into that basket and select the one or two measures that you say, that's going to be good for you, that's going to be good for your economies?
Yeah. I think actually the first thing is to control the epidemic. Yeah. If you cannot control the epidemic, everything is useless, right? You dare not open your border, but other people would certainly not open their borders to you. Mm-hmm. You know how many countries have banned Americans today? I think it's about 150 countries. They will not let any Americans come in. Right? I mean, you can't blame them. Right? And I think Hong Kong, if Hong Kong reflects that certainly the second wave in March was really caused by returning Hong Kong residents. That if at that time they could say we have a strict quarantine, everyone would be in for 14 days before they could do anything, that could have made a difference. And the latest one is harder because I think it's community based. But then I think close to mandatory testing could be that, but it wasn't done, right? Because you really need to. I mean, the whole point is you protect the person because the earlier you can be identified, the better chances you are being healed. But the other thing is that then you can contact trace. If you identify this person the first day, he would only have, say 5 contacts, right? If you allow him to go a week, he could have 100 contacts, and the contacts would have other contacts. So doing it early is the only way to do it. I know that China is now still very strict about people coming in. I have friends who have to go through 14 days in a hotel. They cannot go out. They have to stay in and tested 2 or 3 times before they would be.
Your book has plenty of evidence, data-driven. Yeah. That's what drives your analysis. China was the first and perhaps is still to date the only major economy to have recovered. It went into the low percentage points. Yes. And you could see that bar chart where all the other major economies are on the left, and then China is peaking out on the right. For people watching internationally, great news for China, but does that actually bring some hope for themselves?
Well, I think people learn. I mean, for example, in the U.S., I think many states are now learning that they really shouldn't reopen too soon, right? France is learning, the UK is learning, right? So, because you have to control the epidemic. Otherwise, everything is moot. This whole talk of herd immunity is just nonsense. Because you basically say, okay, everyone should be infected, and if you survive, you have antibodies, you can be infected again.
Professor Lau, I've got one more question for you. You've been so accurate in your predictions throughout this event, from the epidemic into the pandemic and thereafter, using the evidence that you have, which is the economic data. What do you foresee for global economies going forward? And beyond that, what would you tell us as individuals and communities, no matter where we are, to do and not to do?
Well, I think the one thing is for sure. This year, 2020, China is the only major economy with positive growth. Okay, my prediction is that it would be around 3.4%, but there are other estimates. I'm on the optimistic side, but even the pessimistic ones would be more than 2.3%. So it's growing, right? It's better than anyone else, right? And this year, the global economy will shrink between 5 and 6%. The world as a whole, which is probably the worst in many, many decades. Because the entire world, global economy, would shrink for between 5 and 6%. But I'm optimistic that eventually these epidemics will come under control. Okay. Because I think sooner or later, governments will realize that they have to impose mandatory testing. They have to impose contact tracing, right? That's the only way to get out of it. They have their border controls, and I think they will do that. Sooner or later, they discover that there's no shortcut. So you have to do it, and there's cost, but you have to do it because until you can get the epidemic controlled, the economy cannot come back. Right? So I think that is basically the bottom line. Now, I think for individuals, I think my actually advice is really to continue to be careful, right? Because you don't know whether there will be another wave, and another wave is okay, but there could be another virus. It could come just as easily as this one. So why not maintain good hygienic practices, right? And I actually propose that we can retrofit buildings so that they're epidemic proof, so that you have voice-activated elevators. Don't have to press button. It turns out that door handles and elevator buttons are frequently the points in which infection occurs. Okay, because think of elevator button in the top here in this building. You know how many people touched that day?